Here is a turquoise ink by Visconti Turquoise.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
Simply, turquoise isn't my thing, but that doesn't mean I can't give it a fair job at doing this. This is a bright and cool feeling turquoise that certainly performs well from every pen. With that, every pen I used with this gave a different tone to look at, so far from predictable. It does shade very often, really most the time. The blue lean that's there is really showing in its darker tone. For me, this means that if I had a bottle, it would be no chore to use it up. Even though I'm not, a turquoise fan, I'm surprised more people don't have this in their collection and talk about this as being a very nice turquoise, because I think what I'm seeing here is something deserving of much more attention.
The pen for today is
A Sailor 1911 Standard.
All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib which writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy Safari with a broad nib that writes average. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the soft fine nib, this is the lightest tone that we're going to get. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We do get shading throughout the writing, not huge, jumps at it, but certainly does. Look at they on the first line. Starts lighter, goes to a nice darker tone, and then lightens up again. Same thing happens to had. In only 3 letters, it goes from darker to lighter to darker. 1 on the second line goes from light to dark. By shows a very nice dark tone that this could give. So if you got a solid tone, you could really kind of expect that. Maybe a little wetter pen would do that. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine. There's no feather, no spread. There's plenty of shading throughout all of the writing. This is a very blue leaning in what we're getting here, almost to the point that you're saying it's a turquoise leaning blue in how dark it is here. I think it looks nice, but I think it loses a little something of what would make it so good as a turquoise. Looking at the medium nib, it is a whole lot lighter than it was with the wet fine, a little darker than it was with the soft fine. We get no feather, no spread. We do get some shading. Not real standout, but definitely there. More that it's going from a lighter to a lighter mid-tone. Take a look at Cried, where it starts lighter and works its way darker. Thorin, the T starts light, it darkens up, but it lightens up at the RI and then much darker at the N. Almost goes from lighter to darker, and to really see that almost on the second line, you have to look at it in its extremes far left to far right, but it's definitely shading. Looking at the broad nib, it is darker than it was with the medium. There is no feather, there is no spread, there is shading, and plenty of it. I think it's doing a very good job. And I say it's doing a good job in that I can see it, but it's almost got this kind of hidden, indistinguishable bit about it. Take a look at Cakes on the second line, and you see tons of shading changing there without it making a full change on a letter. It's pretty interesting in what's happening as compared to They right next to it, where it starts lighter and works darker. I think it's very interesting when you see the multiple tones this can give all in the same letters. Doing a great job. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There's approximately 10 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is just about the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. Maybe just a tad bit lighter. Now, while it's a tad bit lighter, I think it's just as easy to read. There's no feathering and no spread, and the shading, I think it's not shading as much as it did on the Clairfontaine, but I feel like it's showing better here on the little more absorbent paper. Looking at the wet fine nib, quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, little darker than it is on the Clairfontaine. No feather, no spread, no shading, and you know, I don't think this is exactly the way I would really want to see this. I feel like it's losing its best characteristics, even though the color itself is more appealing to me. In general, as I look at the writings, the writing isn't the most appealing to look at. Looking at the medium nib, it is quite a bit lighter than it was with the wet fine, little darker than it was with the soft fine. No feather, no spread, little bit of shading, just a little bit, not very much at all. You can see it in a couple of spots, like homely on the second line or house on the second line, found on the third line, but not really a shader, so to speak, here. Looking at the broad nib, it is darker than it was with the medium, little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now we get no feather, no spread. It does shade, and when it does shade, I think it's doing a very nice job at it. Look at A on the first line, how it's much darker than everything around it. Where strange goes from lighter at the S, much darker at the T, lightens up until it gets to the end of the word where it gets much darker again. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little bit lighter as far as the darkness goes compared to the Clairfontaine, and we are seeing it go from a blue leaning turquoise to a green leaning turquoise as a result of the tone of the paper. No feather, no spread. It does shade. You see the D on good, you see the L on told, T on about. Pretty much each word does get to have a little bit lighter letter, darker letter. It is shading. And it does look good in this green-leaning turquoise as well. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine. Just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine, though on the Clairfontaine it was blue-leaning. Here it is green-leaning. Again, a result of the paper. No feather, no spread, no shading, solid tone. I think the green leaning turquoise we're seeing here is very nice without the shading. I think it's worth using in this way without the shading because the color itself is nice enough. Looking at the medium nib, it is quite a bit lighter than it was with the wet fine, just a tad bit darker than it was with the soft fine. We have no feather and no spread, almost nothing for shading. I can go point a couple of spots that might be a tad bit darker or might be a tad bit lighter, but that also might have been my hand on the page. I'm going to really go with no shading here. This tone is not a tone that I would really want to see a ton of on this paper. I don't find it especially for me, but it's not like it's a bad one. Looking at the broad nib, it is darker than it was with the medium. We get a tiny bit of feather. You're going to see it on the third line in the T of Hobbit. You're going to see it a little bit on without in the third line, a little bit on the K in back on the second line. So there's a couple of spots. There's no real spread going on. There is a tiny bit of shading going on in that I can see it in right. I can see it in Hobbit. Hobbit on the third line starting a little darker, working its way lighter, and then darker at the T. But then we also see a little bit of feather show up with it. Looking at the back of the page, you can see that the ghosting is really under control. It's heaviest with the broad, but even there, it's not really a problem. Nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. No feathering, no spread. We do get shading just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Maybe a little bit better, I think. I just think it's showing up more frequently and a little more standout here than it did with that Clairfontaine. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine. A little bit, just a tad bit lighter than on the Clairfontaine. No feather, no spread. There's shading, and I can see it when I look at Goblins on the third line compared to History on the first. Even in Goblins, I do see a little bit of shading. Looking at the second line, the is much darker than the word wars, so it's there. But just like on the Clairfontaine, it's not really stand out. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine. Same tone as on the Clairfontaine, with no feather, with no spread, with little bits of shading going on. I think if you were to intentionally write a little bit slower with this, especially in certain areas, I think you could intentionally increase the shading in certain areas if you wanted to. I believe this really has it. The shading's not popping here. It's there from time to time, but it's not really, popping off the page. Looking at the broad nib, it is darker than it was with the medium and a little lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, and we get almost no shading. There's a couple of darker spots, but really almost no shading to speak of here with the broad. Looking at the back of the page, there's no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Colorverse Morningstar. Here is Lamy Turquoise. Here is Pelican Topaz. Here is Roherinklinger Verdigris. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Little, not just lighter, but not as bright a tone, a little bit more flat a tone. Now, we get no feather, we get no spread, we get no shading. I think you could use this. I think you would be a little disappointed in the long run. Like a whole page of this might be just a little too light to really read comfortably. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, a little bit flatter as a tone, not as bright a tone, just as we saw with the soft fine. We get no feather, we get no spread, we get almost nothing for shading. I mean, you can see a little bit on the third line ish and a little bit on the fourth line ish, not really so much. Much more blue leaning here. I think if your teacher required a blue, you might get away with it in this case. It's not bad. You know what? I was going to say I wouldn't use it. I think I would. I don't think there's really a major problem there. I think it reads fairly easy. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine. It is about the same tone as it was with the soft fine, lighter than on the Clairfontaine. No feather, no spread, no shading, no thank you. This would truly be work on your eyes to read a whole page of. Looking at the broad nib, it is darker than it was with the medium, quite a bit lighter than on the Clairfontaine. No feather, no spread. Yes, it shades. No, I don't want it. There's this fine line of if it's too light to really use as a whole page. And if you were using this in your school notes and this is what you had as a whole page, it's just for me over the line of just a little too light for that kind of reading and flipping through notes to really be able to see what's there. Tad bit darker like we had with the wet fine, I think is what it would need here. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is Ackerman Gourmet Pens Pink. Here is Noodler's Operation Overlord. Here is Robert Oster Claret. Here is Krishna Danu Udak. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather, but not horribly. It does spread, but not horribly. It does shade, surprisingly. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, little lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather, does spread, does not shade. However, when you see on the fourth line, you're going to see on with food, it starts to get a bit lighter, and same with and provisions. So it can, I guess, but I wouldn't count on it. Looking at the medium nib, it is quite a bit lighter than it was with the wet fine, a little lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather, of course. It does spread, of course. However, both of those, I think, are a manageable situation on what's happening. The feathering, super light. Doubt it's even going to come through on camera, but look at the word light, very first word. You can see tiny feathers going on. Not a big deal. Same with the amount of spread. So while I'm not a fan of it, I think you could live with it. Looking at the broad nib, it is darker than it was with the medium. It is lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather about as much as it did with the medium, meaning it's there and you could nitpick at it, but I don't see a need to truly do that. It does spread, and it's a significant amount of spread, but not something that I think should stop people from using it. I think overall what I'm seeing as its performance isn't too bad. Now, it does not shade, which on copy paper is a good thing. Looking at the page underneath, you see that the broad touched that page once, and it was the wet fine and the soft fine, surprisingly, that did bleed through a little bit, touching the page underneath. Now, seeing the back of the page, I don't think you could write on both sides and comfortably read the notes because of the very heavy amount of ghosting going on.
So what nib and pen do I recommend using for this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
This ink performs fine from every pen, but always varies in tone, so you need to really choose a tone best for you, which would dictate you using a particular pen. I do really like the darker tone from the wetter broad, but I enjoy the shading more from a medium flow stub. This is a tough choice, but I go for the medium flow stub. It's a nice middle ground when it comes to getting the most out of the shading and the features the ink has in terms of its colors and really trying to show all of that off.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching.